Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We're so glad that you could join us for a very special Sundays at Home program featuring Mrs. Willie Mackey King, moderated by Shelley Stokes-Hammond. My name is Liz Eberlein, and I am the Education Programs Manager at the National Women's History Museum. For those of you who are with us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who have attended a Sundays at Home program before, welcome back. We again thank you for taking time out of your Sunday afternoon to be with us. As always, this presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website following the event. Shelley Stokes-Hammond and Mrs. King will be answering questions at the end of the conversation, so please use the Q&A function on the toolbar at the bottom or the top of your screen to ask any questions that you may have. You can ask those questions at any time during the presentation as you think of them, but we won't be answering those until the end of the conversation. In April 1963, days after Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed for public protests in Birmingham, Alabama, he began smuggling notes out of jail through his lawyers. The notes, which became the letter from a Birmingham jail, were written along newspaper edges, table napkins, toilet paper, and whatever scraps of paper that Dr. King could find to write on. The job of deciphering King's handwritten notes and transcribing them fell to Mrs. Willie Mackey King, a member of the executive staff for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference under the leadership of Dr. King. Mrs. King worked for the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for 32 years, and during her tenure, she served as the accounting officer before becoming the financial manager for the commission. She is a sought-after speaker who is willing to share her journey of service. Some of her speaking engagements include CNN, Church of the Ascension, College of Southern Maryland, District of Columbia Baptist Convention, Legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer, Federal Bureau of Investigation DC Chapter, Howard University Student Campus Ministry, International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, and many, many more. She is a member of the Montgomery Hills Baptist Church in Silver Spring, Maryland, served as chairperson of the Board of Deacons, chairperson of the Board of Trustees, and is a teacher in the AGAPE Sunday School class. Moderating the conversation for us this afternoon is Shelley Stokes-Hammond. Shelley is a writer, historian, and historic preservationist. She is also the daughter of former Congressman Louis Stokes, the first Black congressman elected from the state of Ohio in 1968, and the niece of Carl B. Stokes, the first Black elected mayor of the 8th largest city in the United States, Cleveland, Ohio, in 1967. During the Civil Rights Movement, the Stokes brothers had relationships with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Mrs. King. Her thesis, Recognizing Ludlow, a National Treasure, a community that stood firm for equality, highlights the history of the Ludlow community of Cleveland and Shaker Heights, Ohio, as a model for integration. It also serves as a primary resource for considering the Ludlow neighborhood as one of the 10 sites for the African-American Civil Rights Trail in Cleveland, the only such trail in the North. We are thrilled to have both Mrs. King and Shelley with us this afternoon to share more about this extraordinary moment in history and Mrs. King's life of service and activism. Please welcome Mrs. Willie King and Shelley Stokes-Hammond to our Sundays at Home programming. Shelley, I will turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I also want to thank the audience and Mrs. King for being here today. We are grateful for the opportunity, Mrs. King, to learn firsthand from you more about your connection to Dr. Martin Luther King and his letter from a Birmingham jail. And along the way, we also want to learn more about you and your family, your faith, and relationships you've had with special persons in the civil rights movement, including my father and some other legendary folks, such as his former legal counsel, attorney Fred Gray, and some phenomenal women who are unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. So let's get started. Right off the bat, I guess we should make it clear that even though you have the same last name as Dr. King, the two of you were not related. Is that right?
Absolutely. No, I'm married to a King.
So two great families with the same last name, just not related.
Absolutely. That's right.
Very good. So let's get right to the heart of the story. It's Good Friday. Let's talk, it's Good Friday, April 12th, 1963. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the civil rights movement, is sitting in a jail in Birmingham, Alabama. What's going on?
Dr. King is sitting in jail because he was responding to a call to try and improve the living conditions of Negroes, of Blacks, however you want to term it, in Alabama, one of the most segregated cities in this country, as was reported many, many times in the civil rights movement.
And this particular photograph is a very famous photograph. Do you know who took that?
That photograph was taken by Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, Dr. King's special assistant, executive director. Walker put the camera, a very small camera, he taped it to his ankles. I watched him before he went to the jail and took a chance on not getting caught, so that while he was taking the pictures of Dr. King and Dr. Abernathy in the cells.
That took a lot of courage. And this particular photograph you shared with us is on the cover of your copy of the book, The Letter from the Birmingham Jail, and it's autographed by Reverend Walker. Is that right?
That's right. It says, "To my child." And that's because so often, especially when I think he was a little irritated with me, he'd say things like, in those days, he could get away with it. "Now you look, child." And my response, my retort was, "I am not your child." So it was not coming out the same, child and child. So, and make his joke, he autographed the back of that picture saying, "To my child." CHILE.
So there was a lot of camaraderie between and warm relationships between all of you in the midst of all of this, all the controversy you were up against. The day that King was arrested, he was trying to lead the thousands, at least 1,000 people from the 16th Street Baptist Church to downtown Birmingham. Where were you when he was arrested?
I was standing on the sidewalk watching and basically trembling when they touched him to put those handcuffs on. I was frightened. I did not want him to go to jail, and I kept wondering, Lord, what's going to happen if they take him away? I was concerned for his safety. And I just stood there in horror as they took him away.
And I think that feeling was shared across the world. But Birmingham was the center of the civil rights movement in 1963. And you were one of 4 persons who were most involved in getting Dr. King's message in the form of the letter out to the world. Who else were the key players in the process?
The key players involved his chief legal advisor, Clarence Jones, who was an attorney out of New York. Several of the other attorneys like Ozell Billingsley and anybody that went to see him that the jail is allowed in, he would sneak a piece of paper to them if he had written something. Clarence Jones would bring those scraps of paper, toilet paper, greasy paper napkins, greasy paper bags, and anything that Dr. King could find to write on back to Wyatt, who in turn would give them to me or bring them directly to me so that we could try and transcribe what Dr. King had written.
What a challenge. And what about the role of Andrew Young?
Andy was in the office a lot, taking care of a lot of business. And I would ask him on many occasions, to try and help me decipher what Dr. King had actually written. So I would say, Andy, what do you think he's saying here? What do you think he's trying to say here? And he would come over and try and help me. And he also would console me a lot when I was pretty upset about not being able to figure something out. My vocabulary was not such that I understood a lot of what Dr. King was saying, not to mention that his handwriting was not the best. And writing under those conditions made it even worse.
I can imagine. So to help our audience and for us to set the stage, let's look at a short video clip where Andrew Young tells more of what was happening in Birmingham and regarding this letter. Let's see, do we have sound?
Atlanta saying, look, we have to take on segregation. And the best place to take it on is the worst place in the South, which is Birmingham, Alabama. And I was surprised that Dr. King said yes. And so we agreed to go to Birmingham after the first of the year. Well, that was the movement that started awakening America to the problems of segregation. We were demonstrating to get the right to vote, a right to equal education, a right to work where you shopped, and take down all of the signs that were demeaning and segregated. We had daily demonstrations dramatizing the effects of segregation. We built it up over a period of time so that by the time Dr. King went to jail, there were already 400 or 500 people in jail. And they asked him not to go. They asked him to call it off because even though these were black people, they had signed the bonds of all of these people who were in jail. And so their mortgaged houses were now remortgaged to the jailhouse debt. The paper came out with a full-page ad attacking him by the white clergy. It just set him off. And he was in a cell by himself, and the only papers he had was the New York Times, and he had a copy of this ad, and he started writing the letter from the Birmingham jail around the margins of the newspaper. And he said, very matter-of-factly, every morning when I wash my face and brush my teeth, I'm reminded that this day could be my last. So I have to decide, what am I going to do today that's not only worth living for, but worth dying for if it costs me my life?
So Mrs. King, when Andy Young was talking about how he would look in the mirror every morning and think about whether or not this would be his last day, can you tell us more about what he was saying and how he communicated those thoughts and the sense of urgency and commitment to the members of the team such as yourself?
Dr. King always taught us that there should be something in your life that's worth living for and something in your life worth dying for. We had a prime example of that when we were on the People to People tour, because we had no idea whether we would survive that tour of the state of Alabama.
And that's the picture of you, and then I think we have a picture of you while you're on the tour with Reverend Wyatt there.
Well, I believe that one is not the exact picture of the tour.
I see.
That's in the office, like a strategy session, discussing the tour and the next moves that would take place on the tour. Now, this one is actually a picture of Dr. Wyatt Walker, Bernard Lee, and myself at the Gaston Motel. We took these pictures because we were not certain whether we would survive the trip. And Wyatt Walker suggested that we take pictures and send them to our families so that they would have something to remember us by on this tour, because it was a very, very dangerous tour with lots of threats against Dr. King's life and obviously those that were traveling with him.
And Mrs. King, how long had you all been traveling back and forth from Atlanta to Alabama to conduct this people-to-people tour that ultimately led to the march?
We started the tour on December 6, 1962. There were meetings with the leaders, ministers per se, prior to the tour, because we set up an itinerary of where we would actually visit the churches, the college campuses, and people's homes, because Dr. King wanted to talk directly to the people that would actually be involved in the demonstrations, because those were the people whose houses would be mortgaged, their college education for the children would be forfeited, their jobs would be lost, and in some cases, their lives. And he wanted to make it absolutely clear that this was the risk that you would be taking if you wanted him to come to Alabama and especially to Birmingham to assist with the problems that had existed forever in that state and in that city in particular.
Wow. Very serious commitment indeed. How did you travel to Birmingham given the environment of the times and the risk of segregation?
I mostly traveled by Eastern Airlines. We took several trips by car, but it was too dangerous to drive between Atlanta and Birmingham, because there were times when we would run into difficulty with people that were not friendly at all to any minorities driving. It didn't matter whether or not they were members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, NAACP, CORE, SNCC, or what have you. If you were on the highway, you could be in trouble. So we decided to use the airlines as opposed to driving. It was not a very long drive, but they didn't have the freeway as such then. So it took maybe an hour and a half, or sometimes 2 hours, depending on the traffic.
And in this photograph, is this in front of the hotel where you were staying?
This is actually in front of the Gaston Motel. This is a motel that was owned by a wealthy Black businessman, A.G. Gaston, in Birmingham. And that's where we headquartered. And also that's where we stayed. Dr. King stayed there, the staff stayed there, and most of our guests.
And where did you work out of? Where were you typing this letter?
We had very good office space about a block from the motel in what was called the Smith Building. That was owned by Mr. Gaston's wife's family and Mr. Gaston. And it was actually the headquarters for the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights that was headed by the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, an affiliate of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So they gave us space in their office suite, and that's where we actually operated out.
I see.
Avenue.
Andy Young spoke about this call for unity. Did you have any sense of that while you were working on the project?
I read the article when Wyatt T. Walker came into the office with a copy. Very honestly, it didn't make a lot of sense to me at first until I started typing Dr. King's response. I couldn't understand how anyone would think that what was happening was untimely and not very well thought out, because Dr. King was very organized and always gave a lot of attention to anything that he was involved in. Therefore, it just didn't make sense. And especially coming from clergy. I had expected at least people of the cloth would be much more sympathetic to the plight of the Negro, but as they were called at the time. So this was just nonsense to me. I didn't put a lot of credence in what I was reading.
Understand. So how and when did you first learn that Dr. King was going to respond to this call for unity by writing a letter?
Wyatt Walker had been to the jail to visit Dr. King. He came in with this puzzling look on his face and said, "Miss Willie, we've got a long one here. You know, you're not going to get a lot of rest now because we've got to go at it." And he said, the leader, meaning Dr. King, that's what we called him affectionately, is gonna really want us to get this one out pretty quickly. And I thought it was just a page or two, something like that. Had no idea it was going to be something this long. I wasn't that upset about it. I figured, okay, so bring it on. And then when it started coming in the way it was coming in, I had an entirely different impression of what we had to deal with.
Do you know why he wrote in the margins and on scraps of paper?
He wrote on the margin of the newspaper itself because he had nothing else to write on. He had asked the jailers for writing paper and was told, "This is not a library, you're in jail. So you don't get anything to write on." And he was warned that his lawyers and the people visiting him certainly could not bring anything in either for him to write on. He didn't write freely. He wrote when he was not being watched. That was another thing.
Interesting. Did at any point was he ever given some regular writing paper?
One of the sympathetic jailers eventually, near the very end of what he was writing, gave him some yellow lined paper to write on. But by this time, it, it didn't make a whole lot of difference because we were near the very end of what he was going to write.
It had to be very difficult between the emotional and the environment, the hostile environment, all of the tension. I know that Reverend Walker had said that he didn't think he would see his wife or children anymore. He didn't see how he would get out of that place alive. Does that describe just how much at risk all of you felt while trying to pursue this?
None of us, to my knowledge, felt that we would survive Birmingham. And
Wow.
Certainly we didn't think we'd be able to see our families. It was a way of life at this point. It was something that you had adjusted to, something that you remember Dr. King saying, and that is this should be something that you were willing to live for and something that you're willing to die for. I was very comfortable with the position that I had arrived at because I felt that what we were doing, it was actually worth what the sacrifice in the end would be. So no, I didn't think I would be able to survive it. And I surely didn't think that I would be able to see my siblings or my parents again. But I was okay, because I felt that what we were doing was worth it.
Yeah. Did you know anything more about the sympathetic jailer?
I do not. And I don't think a lot was said simply because the jailer would have been in trouble had it been known that he had tried to assist Dr. King. So there was not a lot of talk at all about this jailer.
Mrs. King, had you had any prior experience with prejudice before Birmingham?
I grew up in the Deep South. One of the first things that I can remember as a child, was I had a little playmate named Jewel. And Jewel and I, along with my sister and one of my cousins, played together almost daily until Jewel started to attend school. So whenever the school bus that she rode would drop her off some evenings, I would be very near the school bus. So I ran up to her and wanted to play, as we had always done. And she recorded, and she says, no. And there were other children standing there watching also, her brothers and sisters and some other kids. And she refused to play with me. And I said, why aren't you going to play with me? And she said, because I was the N-word. So I called her the N-word back because I didn't understand what it meant at the time. So she still wouldn't play, but I really wanted to play with her. So I started pulling on her to play and trying to do what we had always done. Well, her mother reported me to my grandmother, who, in order to satisfy Mrs. Summers, gave me a good little whipping right there in front of her so that I would learn my lesson. And I did. I learned,
Wow.
At that point in time, not to so-called mess with Jewel anymore. But I was really heartbroken because I really liked my little friend Jewel, and so did my sister. Only thing, my younger sister used to beat her up a lot. And so I would stand up for her. My sister would beat up anybody. But, Jewel was just my buddy. And I could not understand how almost overnight it seemed that she changed and just refused to play with me. And that was, I guess, the very first experience I had with segregation and being treated differently. And then I noticed also where Jewel is concerned that she was able to ride the bus to school. And I had to walk 5 miles in each direction. So I thought a couple of times, well, why don't they just throw rocks at the school bus when it passed? So I got in trouble about that. But, it was out of frustration that I acted out because I didn't know what else to do. But those were some very early experiences of segregation with my dear little friend Jewel.
Thank you for sharing that story. I'm sure that when you started working with the SCLC, it took on another level of, appreciation and significance to be working with people to help make things better.
Absolutely.
So we have a slide of how you received all these pieces for the letter. Maybe we can take a look at that. And, we see the pieces of newspaper, the toilet paper. And so we're just trying to imagine you at 22 years old, working with Reverend Wyatt, who understood Dr. King's chicken scratch better. And
yes.
And this was like working out a puzzle. You guys literally had to put pieces on the floor, right?
We had to get down on the floor, spread this out in a lot of cases, and try to figure out what was next. There was no rhyme and a reason because the way the guys had to get it out of the jailhouse, you had to put it under your jacket, but under your shirt also. So there was no bulge or nothing showing so that you wouldn't get pat down. They had gotten kind of used to Clarence Jones going in and out. So they didn't really frisk him at that point like they had started out doing. So he had to make sure that he didn't get caught sneaking things out of the jailhouse, because then all privileges probably would have been cut off for him.
Well, today it's easy to make changes, but in 1963, you were using a typewriter. We have an image of the type of typewriter you were probably, is this what the type of typewriter you were using?
I own that particular typewriter and I have it for sentimental reasons. I typed that letter on the IBM Selectric Typewriter. And there was no way that you could make corrections on pages of material. So in many cases, you had to retype the entire document if there were changes. And the lawyers were taking changes to Dr. King on a regular basis so that he could see exactly where we were, or he could change his mind about something that he had actually written. And in a lot of cases, things changed. I was not a happy camper when things changed, but it was a part of the job.
So towards the end, the Dr. King started it on, I guess, Good Friday, the 12th. And then you all were complete. You had a complete document by the 16th, 4 days later.
Yeah, I didn't get any sleep for 2 nights and 3 days. We were at it. We did not stop.
Well, I know.
See, in my job, you didn't have a 9 to 5. You worked until the project was finished.
Well, I remember reading that Reverend Walker said, my personal secretary, Willie Mackey, sat on a typewriter while I translated it and she typed it. And I remember one night about 12:30, 1 o'clock, she was so exhausted, she fell asleep on the typewriter. He
likes to tell that story. Well, he did, bless his soul. I have no recollection of falling asleep. I do remember waking up, sitting on the couch, and I was frightened because Wyatt T. Walker was not the easiest person in the world to work for. And I went, oh my goodness, what happened? So I didn't open my eyes completely. I cracked my eyelids a little bit to try and see what kind of mood he was in before I moved. I was afraid to actually move. I sat there still because he was sitting at my typewriter and I'm sitting on the couch, which is a little bit reversed to, what I expected to be doing. So according to him, I was so exhausted that my head just dropped on the typewriter.
I see. Well, let's listen to Dr. King read the opening paragraph of that letter.
My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that cross my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms.
Thank you, Liz. That's good. So how did you feel with the opening paragraph where Dr. King acknowledged his secretaries before he talks about Socrates, St. Augustine, Thomas Jefferson?
Dr. King was always complimentary, very appreciative of the work of his secretaries. He acknowledged us. He did not allow people to disrespect us or anything like that. I remember several times, even when I was upset with Dr. Walker, Dora, who was the confidential assistant to Dr. King, would say to me, do you want me to talk to Dr. King about that? Or do you want to tell him? And I said, oh, no, you're not getting me fired. I'm just going to have to tolerate the situation because she knew and I knew that if Dr. King was aware that we were being mistreated in any kind of way, he would not stand for it. Now, in the day, don't get me wrong, things that happened then would not happen now. But fixing the coffee, making sure the water was, pitchers were refilled, running to get the sandwiches and that kind of thing, spreading a napkin out, putting it in front of him. I had no problems with that. But, you know, he didn't stop him from having me do that. But you did not treat us poorly in terms of the way you talked to us or disrespected us, not only the staff, but other people outside of the staff. He didn't allow that to happen.
And we have here one of the original copies of what your very first typed copy of the letter was. That is held in the archives of Samford University in Birmingham. It's part of the George Bagley collection. Bring back any memories?
The memory that it brings back is why would they put my mistakes in there too?
Yeah, we noticed
there were
some
not that many
notations, corrections.
There were not that many, but you know, they could have let me clean it up before they published it. But they wanted to, whenever they found this in the archives at the Birmingham office of SCLC and the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, they took it and published it as it was.
And if we look at the next slide, we will actually see where we have, for the credit for the persons who worked on this document, we see down in that lower left-hand corner, Dr. King's initials, colon, and then yours, MLK, colon, WM.
Willie Mackey, yes.
That's awesome. So, you know, we want to make sure we just cover a few more things before we open up for questions. We know that in May, just, you know, a few weeks later, there was this children's crusade where 1,000 children had left school to protest nonviolently and were jailed, and that caught the attention worldwide. And that also led to more national attention by and more interaction with President Kennedy and Dr. King. I think we have a slide of President Kennedy, and so that influenced his famous civil rights address. But people who wanted to talk to Dr. King, they were calling you to get to him, right?
When we were on the road, you had to come through me. In the headquarters, you went through Dora, unless I was filling in for Dora. One of the things that I remember so vividly, though, about the president, and your father also, I might add, is they were not irritated if they called and their assistants put them on the phone. For a lot of people, they didn't want to hear a secretary's voice. They came on, they said, Martin, they expected him to answer right away. The president was not that way. He, whether it was genuine or not, I don't know, but he had a little bit of small talk. How are you? Hello, or something like that. And so did Louis Stokes. You know, they would have some small talk that was showing that they were not irritated that they had to go through, hear the voice of the secretary first. That endeared him to me. You know, obviously anybody would be excited to hear the president's voice.
Certainly. So, Mrs. King, did you know all about civil rights when you first started working with the SCLC? Did you know?
I had never heard the word civil rights. I knew absolutely nothing about it. I grew up in a very small town, as you know, in Georgia, and that was not something that you talked about. You didn't hear it at school, obviously. You didn't hear it at the church, and you certainly didn't hear it at your home. So no, I knew absolutely nothing about civil rights.
And we can just quickly go through the next couple of slides just for the audience to remember that, you know, We start with President Truman desegregating desegregating the Army, Emmett Till, and under Brown versus Board of Education, the Montgomery bus boycott, where Attorney Fred Gray is Dr. King's first legal counsel, and also for Rosa Parks. And then we have Little Rock. And then on the next slide, we're going through, the 1957 law for voter rights, the Greensboro sit-ins, and then the Ruby Bridges story. So all of that is leading up to when you hit the scene. And how about the SCLC? I guess how did you even get the opportunity to work for them?
I had walked off of, that was the second job I had walked off of because I felt I was being mistreated, not because of civil rights. That was not in my vocabulary at the time, but because something was wrong with the way I was being treated. When I worked at the university, my boss, who liked me very much, asked me to get the ladies to go in the back, and a group of white students were sitting at the lunch counter with blackened faces, and they had the other students pouring coffee and drinks. And they said, if we integrate our schools, this is what it's going to come to. And so I thought it was wrong that she asked us to go in the back and allow this to happen. So I said to my coworkers, she doesn't really care about us. We need to leave. So we left, but I didn't realize she overheard me encouraging people to leave. So she called everybody else that night, but she didn't call me. So they went back to work. So I didn't have a job the next day. I just felt like, all right, I'm going to go somewhere else. So I went to another place, got a job. At that hospital, one of my coworkers had a heart attack at a dish machine, working on a dish machine. It's a hospital. Not a single nurse or a single doctor would go near Pop. So his coworkers took him on the loading dock, where he had to wait in rush hour traffic for an ambulance to come from downtown Grady, the General Hospital, wow, pick him up and take him there for treatment. Wow. Now, poor Pop, he survived the heart attack. He came right back to work at that hospital because he had no choice, he said. He had a family and he had bills to pay. So he went back to work at that hospital. That I felt a slap in the face, but at the same time, I understood what was happening. Now, at the house where I lived, there was a woman who dressed very nicely, spoke very nicely, and what have you, that lived in the same house on the first floor. She asked me one day if I was looking for work. And I said, yes, I need a job. She said, are you in school? I said, I certainly am. She said, do you type and take shorthand? Obviously, that was the only thing that people were offering people like me at that time. So she told me there was an opening for a secretary where she worked. And she gave me the address, and a friend and I went. The friend didn't tell me, but when we got there, she applied for the job also. Turns out that I don't know how on earth it happened, but the gentleman that interviewed me was Ghoul Maynard. And he was from the islands, had a very thick accent. He dictated the letter, I typed it perfectly and got the job at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
That's beautiful. And Dorothy Cotton was the person who helped you, right?
Dorothy recommended that.
I think we have a photograph of her.
She recommended that I go to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and apply for the job. And she didn't try to influence anybody. You know, I was on my own because that's the way Dorothy is. It was. So I went, and as I said, I don't know how it happened, but I was able to take the dictation and transcribe it and get the job. Dorothy was a member of the People to People tour, as you see, with Bernard Lee and myself in December 7th, 1962. She too took pictures so that she could send to her relatives and what have you, so that if anything happened, which we were certain it would, that our families would have pictures to remember us by.
Great. And another unsung hero was Septima Poinsett Clark.
Septima Poinsett Clark was a very instrumental person to the citizenship education program at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. When she came to SCLC, she and Esau Jenkins out of South Carolina had been training grassroots people for years on how to read, to write, and do things that just were in compliance with everyday living. So she brought that program to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and we trained hundreds of people in the South to read and to write and to do simple arithmetic in addition to other things. Septima Clark had a way of making people who were not educated or what have you feel comfortable and willing to learn under her guidance. And that was the asset that she brought to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And we refer to her as the mother of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
That's great. Thank you. So so you continue working for the SCLC. Music was also part of these workshops, the citizenship training, the 5-day workshops where you all brought people in from all over the South so that they could go back and motivate and register Black voters. Music was a part of that.
Music was an integral part of the movement. We sang in the paddy wagons, we sang in the jails, we sang at mass meetings. I am not a singer. My sister said I can't carry a tune in a bucket, but I tell you what, I want to give you a little bit of flavor of what the singing was like, if you don't mind. It was something that went like this. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. We gonna keep on a walking, keep on a talking, walking up to freedom land. And then we had another one of my favorites that said, oh, freedom over me. It went something like this. Oh, freedom over me, over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. And that would always get an audience at a mass meeting or what have you in the mood of actually putting their lives on the line or what have you for the cause, just for the cause, you know. And obviously all of us learned we shall overcome.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It brings back a lot of memories, and I'm sure for others who have been around long enough to remember being in meetings or sessions and hearing some of those songs. You know, we're going to try to just highlight a couple of things so that we have time for questions from the audience. This has been so great listening to all you've had to share. This pledge card is just how seriously Dr. King promoted nonviolence, where all volunteers had to sign one of these cards to say that they were going to follow the 10 commandments. We can't, you know, we don't have enough time to review all of those, but, you know, I think it conveys the commitment to nonviolence. And you left the SCLC in 1966, but you still stayed in touch with everybody. And in 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated, you you were we just quickly to go through this slide shows the same day you were at a board meeting for the SCLC in Richmond was the same day as the Birmingham of the church that resulted in the lost lives of 4 little girls. But you guys were still going, you still continued on with the march in Washington, just for the audience to get a sense of all the different parts of the civil rights movement that you were there. And
at the time that the 16th Street Church was bombed, Dr. King and his staff, were in Richmond, Virginia, attending a board meeting. We knew Denise McNair very well because she was the daughter of Chris McNair, who took a lot of pictures. He was a great photographer for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We were all in shock, and immediately the board meeting was over and we traveled back to Birmingham to be with the families of those slain girls. But specifically, you would think about little Denise, a child, and
Sure.
it just meant so much for us to be with that family at that time.
I can imagine that must have been awfully hard.
It was
Mrs. King, I
very
think we're going to try to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. There's so much more I wish we could talk about, but we want to give them a few minutes to be able to ask you some more questions. So I'm going to turn off my camera. And
Oh,
so
no,
that
Shelley,
Liz can-
stay. Please
Oh, can
stay.
stay? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have many questions from the audience. And one of the questions, Mrs. King, was a question that you prophesied that you would get, and it's about the letter and how it was written. So the question is, I didn't realize the letter was written in snippets over time. Was Dr. King able to envision the order in which he wanted the contents written, or did you have to edit the order of the notes to make it more cohesive?
We had to, when I say Wyatt had to edit those scraps of paper and put it in a sensible order. Dr. King had some semblance of the order because he was answering the specific allegations or questions raised by the ministers. So it wasn't totally without guidance, but because of the way it came into us, there was no rhyme, no reason, or no order.
Which just made the entire process even more difficult, I'm sure. And you even mentioned at the very beginning of the program that Dr. King's handwriting was not the best. So trying to decipher the writing and then also the order that this should have been in, I'm sure was a very difficult task, which you and others so admirably put together. And Shelley, we had not a question so much as a comment from one of our attendees. She says, thank you so much for moderating this wonderful program. She wanted to let you know that she grew up in South Euclid outside of Cleveland and that your father was her congressman. And then during the early 80s went on to represent the Cuyahoga County Commissioners at the State House. She said your father and uncle were such terrific leaders. So that's just a comment for you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's really nice to know.
And then she went on, Mrs. King, to have a question for you. She asked, given the contents of the letter, as well as its beautiful prose, how did Dr. King develop the skills to produce such a stirring and memorable document in such a short time and under the circumstances that he was in, being in prison and having to smuggle this letter out in pieces?
I would tell you from the bottom of my heart that it was God inspired. He was dealing in a religious set of circumstances with 8 ministers. He was speaking from a ministerial point of view and from a moral standpoint of view, from a Christian point of view, and from a human point of view. He had all these combinations together, which developed an outstanding document.
Mm-hmm. And there was a question about the sympathetic jailer who provided the paper. Do you think they were sympathetic to the cause, or just thought that it was cruel to withhold something as simple as paper?
Dr. King never made too much mention of this person. He said a kind jailer.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea who this jailer was or what have you, but evidently this person had shown Dr. King some favor.
Yeah.
Not only in terms of the lined paper that he gave him to write on, but in general. So it could have been a combination of being sympathetic to the movement and sympathetic to the conditions under which Dr. King was having to endure. They didn't make it comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can only imagine the circumstances that this all came about, so which makes it even more remarkable. And just a reminder to the audience, if you do have a question for either Shelley or Mrs. King, we are getting to as many of those questions as we can, but please do put those in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to those in the few minutes that we have remaining. But we have another question about Dr. King. And how he interacted with or responded to, whether that was written or whether that was via the telephone, how he interacted with foreign leaders' use or misuse of his message and the civil rights struggle, if he even did interact with them at all. Do you have any insight or knowledge about that at all?
I can tell you that there were times Dr. King would be very concerned how insensitive people were to the plight of the Negro and the period of time to tell somebody to wait when you have been tolerating these conditions all of your life. And, you know, wait is not an option at this point. Dr. King would not, as he said, have had time to do anything else, and neither would we, his secretarial staff, if he tried to answer even a large number of complaints against what we were doing. There were complaints, and mind you, they were not all from people who look like me. There were complaints from people who looked like me and people that were Caucasian and every other nationality, who said that he was a troublemaker, an outsider, and was, according to my own family, going to get somebody killed.
And the story that you were telling a little bit earlier about the university and how you told everybody that you should leave and no longer had a job. The attendee kind of didn't catch that entire story. Was that some kind of demonstration? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
The students were writing an article for their newspaper, for the student newspaper. I did remember at one time the name of the newspaper. And they were in the process of integrating this well-known college in Atlanta. And this particular group of students were against integration of their school. So they put that article there to say, if you allow the Blacks to come into our school, you will end up waiting on them. This is what it's going to look like in our future, and we do not want this. So that's why they were pouring, the Blacks were actually seated, and the non-Blacks were pouring the water, the coffee, and the juice.
And we have time for one final question. Again, my apologies to everybody who submitted one that we are just not able to get to today. Although if you do have a question that you would like for Mrs. King or Shelley to answer, you can certainly send us an email at history@womenshistory.org, and I would be happy to pass that along to Mrs. King. But kind of this final question, what immediate impact did Dr. King's letter have on the clergy's position, which had really prompted the writing of this letter in the first place? What was that impact?
The impact on, I'm sorry.
The impact on the clergy's position, which kind of had prompted him to write the letter in the first place.
The 8 ministers, for the most part, denied having received the response.
Oh my
So
goodness.
that way they didn't have to deal with it. I personally know that we did take them to the addresses that we were able to glean from the library there. The woman was very uncooperative. She said, I will only give you 3 addresses at a time. And so that meant like today, I would call back. She said, I just talked to you. And she would hang up on me. We tried to go to the library and use the facilities there to come up with addresses. And obviously we were not allowed to use the public library there in Birmingham. So it took some time to actually get them mailed, but it was at night even. And luckily we had a machine that we could weigh the letters and put the postage on them. Now, where they went from there, I don't know, but they went to the post office.
Wow.
Wow.
What an incredibly powerful story. I want to thank you, Mrs. King and Shelley, so very much again for being with us today. Again, to our audience, I apologize that we were not able to get to all of your questions, but please do contact us if you do have a question. I'd be happy to pass those along. But I want to thank you. Just a reminder that this presentation today is being recorded. It will be available on the National Women's History Museum's website later this week. I believe that the link to the Sundays at Home webpage was posted in the chat. That will be available later this week. If you enjoyed today's program, please join us on Sunday, Sunday, August 22nd at 3 p.m. for a screening of the film Borderlands, The Life and Times of Blanche Ames in celebration of Women's Equality Day. On Sunday, September 19th at 3 p.m., we will be honoring Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg 1 year after her death. And we'll be joined by Amanda L. Tyler, who co-authored Justice, Justice, Thou Shalt Pursue, a life's work fighting for a more perfect union, who she co-wrote with the formidable Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And we'll be joined by Dr. Melissa Murray for that conversation. Again, that's September 19th. We do have many more upcoming programs in addition to those that I just highlighted. For a full list of those upcoming programs and for registration information, please visit the Sundays at Home page under the Public Programs tab on the womenshistory.org. All events are free, but advanced registration is required. But I want to thank you both so incredibly much for your preparation and your time. This has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. It's been an absolute delight to work with you both. And I want to thank you sincerely on behalf of the National Women's History Museum and all who attended today for this absolutely fantastic conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mrs. King.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Liz. And thank you, Janet.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all who have attended. Thank you for your wonderful questions. We do hope to see you at another Sundays at Home program. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you all.
Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.